Okay, Jeff Bale, thanks so much for joining again.
Yeah, you're welcome.
It's great, so great to have you. I wanted to start by asking you about what's going on in Minneapolis, and see if I can frame this appropriately as I perceive it, which is that Trump won the election. One of the pillars of his campaign was closing the border and mass deportations of illegal immigrants.
Hmm.
We're a year into his administration, and he's mobilized ICE in order to carry out this campaign promise.
Hmm.
One of the sort of flashpoint cities is Minneapolis. So there's been a mobilization to deport people. In the last 2 months, basically, the Somali fraud case has sort of popped up. It's been alleged that there's as much as $18 billion of
Hmm.
fraud
Correct.
with healthcare and other kind of state programs are essentially fraudulent. Um,
Yes.
and then most recently, during this mobilization, 2 people have been killed by ICE and Border Patrol in their operations to deport people.
Correct.
And Minneapolis is a sanctuary city, so called, which is confusing to me, but is basically not cooperating with federal law enforcement on a policy that the majority of Americans voted for.
Correct.
So, what is your view, basically, on what is going on now?
Well, I consider, first of all, sanctuary cities and sanctuary states uh, are not legal. States and municipalities do not have a right to violate federal laws, according to the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. Um, Federal laws take precedence over state laws, except with regard to those activities that are the responsibility of the federal government, and that would include immigration enforcement. You can't have a situation where every uh, every every state in America has a separate immigration policy. I mean, you have to have a national immigration policy, and that's something that Congress has voted on, and there's laws, immigration laws on the books. And the president, of course, is concerned with national security issues. He has a right to identify national security threats, and certainly an open border is a national security threat. And the president is legally obligated to enforce immigration laws, even though Biden didn't do it, and many past presidents didn't do it. And so now you've got this absurd situation where states think that they have a right to openly defy federal laws. That's in violation of the Constitution. So that's the first thing. And if you actually look at these deep blue states that are engaged in this activity, they're exactly like the southern states in the 1950s and the 1960s that were defying federal civil rights law. The segregationist politicians, state and local politicians, and elements of police chiefs and stuff who were segregationists, and some of whom had linked to the Klan and all this kind of stuff. These were people that were deliberately violating federal civil rights laws, and trying to mobilize massive resistance against federal civil rights laws. And that forced President Eisenhower and JFK to send troops down to southern states to ensure that federal civil rights laws were enforced. And I don't see how what these Democrat states are doing now in terms of attempting to violate uh, immigration laws is any different than the segregationist states did in the 50s and 60s in their attempts to defy and violate federal civil rights laws. To me, it's the very same thing. And when presidents sent troops down there to enforce those laws, nobody, well, maybe the segregationists were calling them fascists, quote unquote, but the fact is that everybody understood, the majority of Americans understood that it was necessary that the federal government deploy troops to ensure that federal civil rights laws were enforced. And essentially, that's what the federal government is doing now. The administration is simply trying to enforce federal immigration laws, which the states are deliberately violating. And not only are the states deliberately violating federal immigration laws in violation of the Constitution, but the fact is that they're also fomenting an insurrection. They're trying to mobilize popular resistance in the same way that segregationist politicians did in the South. They're trying to mobilize massive resistance and mobilizing encouraging activists to try to impede the activities of federal law enforcement personnel. And they're also ordering local police forces not to cooperate with federal law enforcement officers. I mean, that's exactly what the segregationist states did in the South. So, I mean, to me, this is it's just a clear example of the states trying to usurp the power of the federal government with respect to immigration laws, and it's completely unconstitutional. And I mean, I don't see how it could possibly be legal, and I don't understand why there's not lawsuits against these states. And I don't even understand, frankly, why officials in some of these states who are defying federal laws aren't being arrested. I mean, that's what I think should happen. So that's the first thing. I mean, this whole thing, this resistance, quote unquote, against federal immigration enforcement is just, that, like you said, the majority of Americans voted for closing the border and for deporting illegal aliens. And so basically what you have is the minority of Americans who voted for the Democrats and who were opposed to these policies, who are trying to basically subvert the will of the majority of American people. I mean, I don't see how else you can characterize it. It's like an organized minority trying to subvert the will of the majority. I mean, so I don't see how that can be allowed to continue. I mean, it effectively is a kind of de facto insurrection, I think. And at some point, it's going to have to be declared an insurrection. And the only thing that could really change the situation would be if these progressive politicians would dial down their insane rhetoric about comparing like ICE agents to like the Gestapo and the SS, and calling Trump Nazi and Hitler and all this kind of insane overheated rhetoric, which has exactly whipped up these kind of popular hysteria, which has led to these kinds of protests and so forth and so on. They have to dial that down, but they don't want to dial it down. They're getting exactly what they want. What they want to do is create incidents involving federal law enforcement personnel where individuals are injured or shot, which they can then exploit politically, to try to increase the votes for their own party. I mean, to me, that's what it is: a cynical ploy, mobilizing a bunch of useful idiots to protest, but not just to peacefully protest. I mean, I don't have peaceful protest is protected First Amendment activities. People have a right to peacefully protest. They have a right to express opinions. They have a right to wave signs. They have a right to do street theater. They have a right to do all those things. What they don't have a right to do is they don't have a right to block roads and bridges. They don't have a right to physically impede law enforcement officers from carrying out their jobs. I mean,
Jeff, is that the line? What is the line between civil disobedience and insurrection?
Well, that's a complicated question, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't necessarily want to. I don't know that I can actually clarify that distinction. But civil disobedience is there's limits to civil disobedience. If it reaches a point where it involves extreme violence, like throwing bricks and Molotov cocktails and things like that at law enforcement personnel, or besieging federal buildings, or trying to blind people with lasers, or like the Antifas did in Portland, like literally lay siege to a federal building for weeks at a time. I mean, that's clearly not legal. That's not civil disobedience. That's violent insurrectionary activity, which is certainly not protected by the First Amendment. So to me, I don't. These people have clearly crossed the line, and they're deliberately crossing the line. Obviously, there's all these left-wing extremists, the Antifas and sectarian communists and so forth, who are mobilizing and sending people to Minnesota. But then the bigger problem is like the kind of, I guess you could say, the kind of like these kinds of progressive people, especially these, a lot of whom are women, who are, who have believed all this hysterical rhetoric uh, that the Democrat politicians and the media have been using to characterize Trump and to characterize attempts to enforce immigration laws. They actually have this fantasy that they're like, like the resistance in World War II, apparently. Like they think that they're like fighting the Nazis or something. So there's all these people who are out on the street, trying to impede law enforcement personnel from carrying out their duties. And let's take just a garden variety criminal case. If the police are chasing a suspect or trying to go to an address where a criminal suspect is living, any civilian who tries to interfere with the carrying out of their duties is immediately subject to arrest. You do not have the right to physically impede law enforcement officers from carrying out their legitimate functions. And that's exactly what's going on here. I mean, so when you think about, you think it's not, it'd be one thing if people were just standing on the street and yelling and carrying signs and blowing whistles and all that sort of thing. That's one thing. But if you're out actually in the street, blocking the street, blocking the walkways, trying to prevent law enforcement personnel from pursuing or apprehending um, uh, people who have broken the laws, who've broken immigration laws, and in many cases, people who are criminals, who have serious records of violent crime, rapes and murders and things like that, or members of gangs. If you're trying to block federal officers from arresting those people, then you're subject to arrest yourself. That's not something that's protected First Amendment activity.
Yeah.
It's not speech. It's action, and it's not protected action. It's not peacefully. It's the First Amendment protects the right to peacefully assemble. It doesn't protect the right to physically confront law enforcement officers, or to carry out acts of violence. And so when
What
people
did you think of the Jeff? What did you think of the two incidents?
I mean, look, they're tragic incidents. It's always a tragedy when a civilian, is killed. But these people put themselves. They were deliberately engaged in activities which could potentially escalate into exactly what happened there. I mean, the woman, I mean, was parked there for several minutes, partially blocking the street. She was honking her horn, just being a complete nuisance when they were trying to carry out an operation to arrest people at a nearby residence. And she wasn't alone. And several times, and her partner was out there on the street yelling and screaming and harassing law enforcement personnel. And then they kept telling her, "Look, move on, move on." And then finally they said, "Get out of the car," because they were going to arrest her because she was impeding their operations. And then she, instead of complying, when a police officer tells you to get out of the car, that's not an option. It's not optional. If you refuse to do that, then you're committing another crime, and you're potentially escalating a situation where it could lead to violence. And so when she decided, at the urging of her partner, to push her foot on the accelerator and try to drive off when they were trying to open the doors and arrest her, I mean, that was creating a dangerous situation. And one of the officers, rightly or wrongly, felt that he was in danger of being hit by her car, and then reacted in the way he did. Now, it's easy to second guess people. I've looked at many videos of the thing, and it's a little bit complicated. I mean, she was obviously creating all kinds of problems before the actual incident where she was shot. Depending on the view you look at it, it could say, well, maybe she was trying to drive away, but she actually bumped him. And this was the same policeman who had been dragged in a previous incident, like 60 yards, by some other driver who was engaging in completely illegal activity. And so, it's understandable, after having already gone through an incident where he was hit by a car and dragged by a car, that he would fear the worst in the situation. And then he reacted in the way he did, and maybe it was an overreaction. I don't know. these are split-second decisions that people make, and it's easy for people to look back later and go, "Oh, shouldn't have done that," or some people said, "Oh, he did everything he did was totally justified." Some people say, "Oh, what he did was completely inappropriate." I mean, I mean, there should be a detailed examination of that incident with forensic analysis and all this kind of stuff. So I totally disagree with like the initial response by DHS that this was not an incident that should be investigated. Any kind of incident involving an officer shooting needs to be investigated by a fair-minded body to determine what actually happened. And if somebody did something engaged in wrongdoing, they should be punished for wrongdoing. And you want to identify what happened so you can prevent future incidents like that from happening. So so again, I mean, that there should be an investigation of all these shootings, like there are with police shootings, and to determine what the situation was and get more clarity. Because unfortunately, given the polarized climate in this country, the moment one of these incidents happens, people on both sides immediately jump to the conclusion that their preferred conclusion. They don't even care about the facts. They're just believing whatever they want to believe.
Yeah.
And then the more recent incident, I just watched a video just this morning, like before we got on. I hadn't actually seen the video of this recent shooting. And this is another one of those cases that's just absolutely friggin' bizarre. Because first of all, what happened was this guy was in the street. The guy who was shot. He was in the street, first of all, kind of like urging people to engage in sort of obstructive activities. And then there was a woman that was having some kind of altercation with an ICE officer, and he went over there and rushed to protect her because she wasn't complying, she wasn't getting out of the road. And then there was a second woman there who tried to intervene when the ICE officer was coming over to remove, to get them out of the road. And so the ICE officer pushed her, and then this guy got in the way and physically confronted the ICE officer. Okay. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to physically confront law enforcement officers like that.
Yeah.
That makes you immediately subject to arrest. And then it just got worse from there. Then like the guy was sort of wrestling, and then he was wrestled to the ground, and other ICE officers came over, and all these people around were yelling and, carrying on. And then one of the ICE officers discovered this guy had a pistol in a holster right there. He had a pistol in his holster, and so the ICE, during this kind of struggle, they were kind of struggling to get him on the ground to put handcuffs on him. Yeah. One of the officers removed the gun from his holster, right? And then the guy was still fighting and resisting, and he actually reached down where his holster was, although the guy had already, the policeman had already moved the gun. So it looked to me like the other officers thought he was reaching for his gun and weren't even necessarily aware that the gun had been removed. And anyway, so then the guy just said, "Well, this is a dangerous situation. He could be reaching for a gun," and they shot him. I mean, it was a terrible incident. It was led to the loss of somebody's life. It was, but it was in the midst of this melee. Where a guy was physically resisting, like an officer. I just, one of the things that I never understand, and if you ever watch like these reality TV shows where the police, are pulling people over because they're driving strangely, or because they're, for whatever reason they're behaving weirdly or engaging in belligerent behavior or something like that. The first thing you realize is that the dumbest thing you can do is that the police orders you to do something is to resist, is to refuse to do it, is to resist, and even the dumbest thing to do is actually wrestle with an officer and physically confront an officer. And that's going to guarantee you being arrested and charged with a more serious crime,
Yeah.
And it could lead to an escalation where somebody gets hurt.
I can't imagine that's like one of the first things you learn as an adult human being.
That's right.
Obey the commands of an officer of the law.
That's correct. That's right.
And like probably nothing bad is going to happen to you. And if you have a bad interaction, like you get a badge number and you keep your mouth shut.
Right. You behave.
It's like just part of being like a functioning member of society.
Yeah, it's like part of being a functioning adult. You
Yeah,
comply. You're polite and you comply with somebody when they ask you to show IDs
but
or if you know.
Jeff, I think there's an interesting dynamic here where the people who they're sort of useful idiots that have gotten into these situations
Oh, absolutely
where
useful.
there's some element of live action role playing and
Correct.
non-reality to what they're
Yes,
doing. And you
I
mentioned before
totally
that they've
agree with.
been kind of like propagandized by they think they're fighting Nazis, essentially.
Yes,
They've been
yes.
convinced of this. And then they're out like the video of the lesbian woman, her wife,
Hmm.
before I don't know if you saw the video, but her interaction with she's like taunting the ICE agency
That's right.
agent and being macho and everything.
That's right.
And then what winds up happening is they're confronted with like the actual danger of doing that to a federal law enforcement
Correct.
officer in a dangerous situation.
Yeah, I agree with
Um,
that 100%. In other words, you're right. I think a lot of these people are like they've been whipped up into hysteria by all this absurd rhetoric about Nazis, and they think that they're fighting Nazis, and so they're like getting out there on the front lines and acting tough and being deliberately trying to provoke the officers, yelling insults, blowing whistles, standing in front of them, blocking the streets with cars, doing all those kind of nonsensical things. And like you said, it's like they think that like this kind of thing is like a live action role play. It's like revolutionary cosplay. You know,
mhm.
they imagine that they're like members of like the French resistance in World War II fighting against the Nazis. That's the fantasy world they're living in. And then they're behaving in completely stupid, provocative, dangerous ways that are endangering themselves and endangering other people. And they don't realize that there can be real world consequences to this kind of like performative behavior, this kind of performative virtue signaling, which is what the left is so good at, performative virtue signaling. You know, and they also have this like level of moral self righteousness. They think that they're like the most morally righteous people in the world, and that the people who they're opposed to are intrinsically evil. And they just have this simple-minded, black and white Manichaean worldview, which causes them to behave in utterly stupid ways, and will inevitably lead to these kinds of confrontations, and in some cases, tragedies. And the worst part about it is that the media and Democrat politicians are egging these people on by using that kind of inflated, alarmist, hysterical rhetoric. They're using them as they are useful idiots, like you said. They function effectively, essentially as useful idiots, not only for the Democrats who are cynically using them to try to create incidents to help them win an election, but also by the radical left, by hardcore radical leftists who are really trying to just over to create a revolutionary situation in their mind. So
Well,
these kind of naive progressives who have been the victims in these cases are basically sort of functioning as useful idiots for left-wing extremists and for cynical politicians who, as you pointed out, are trying to distract attention from the massive scandal, the Somali scandal in Minnesota, which is then it's not only Minnesota, it's in many other states what's going on. So
but
yeah,
is there any difference, Jeff? Is there any difference between, you know, the Democratic Party and the radical foot soldiers that we see on the street at this point? Because this seems to be there are these signal chat groups to organize. This
yes,
is like a very orchestrated and organized movement. It feels like a left-wing insurgency.
yes. Well,
Um,
what they're
and
trying
it's
to do is
it's I think there's a common misconception that people like Tim Walz and the Democrat establishment are sort of like arm's length and this is a convenient thing that's happening, rather than this movement is one and the same, that these people are essentially one and the same.
well, I wouldn't go. I mean, I wouldn't say that they're arm's length, nor would I say they're one and the same. I mean, to me, they're playing a very dangerous game. The Democrat Party seems to have adopted this view that there's no enemies on the left. In other words, nothing that left-wing extremists do uh, do they now criticize or try to suppress. So when you had all those violent protests, the violent pro-Palestinian protests and all that kind of stuff, or protests and supporting Maduro recently, all this kind of nonsense, all these people were on the street, blocking the street, harassing by people on the other people who were near them, yelling at the police, blocking traffic, doing the usual nonsense that they always do. And they're just cheered on. The media seems to cheer them on. The Democrat establishment seems to cheer them on. That somehow this is like, this is all part of the resistance against Trump, and we need to mobilize the resistance against Trump to win the election. And so they've basically, unlike on the Republican side, where there's been severe criticism by conservative establishment of right-wing extremists. On the Democrat side, you don't see denunciations by responsible Democrat politicians. You don't see them denouncing the extremist violent activities of radical leftists on the street, or who are collaborating often with the Islamists now, theocratic right-wing lunatics. So you don't see the Democrats condemning those people or trying to distance themselves from those people. On the contrary, what you see is the Democrats trying to make instrumental use of them. They're trying to make instrumental use of these kinds of violent extremists for their own political purposes. I mean, that's what they're trying to do. So you can't say that these I would call them progressive girly men like Tim Waltz and Jacob Fry, that these people are like hardcore revolutionaries. There's no difference between them and like the most sociopathic left-wing thug. You can't conflate them like that. But they're people who are deliberately playing a dangerous game for what they think is going to be their own political advantage. That's what they're doing. And the problem, history is replete, by the way, with examples of dimwits in the establishment, encouraging or fomenting protests, even violent protests, which then get totally out of hand and lead to the overthrows of the entire political system. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen here, because these left-wing extremists don't have the capabilities or the intelligence to actually overthrow anything. But they certainly have the capability to create chaos and do lots of damage, which of course is what they do. It's what they regularly do. So whenever people from the establishment are apologizing for, or tacitly encouraging or refusing to criticize extremists, I mean, they're playing a dangerous game. And that's exactly what the Democrat Party is doing. Maybe Fetterman, again, the only sane Democrat now, apparently. But you don't see anybody else out there denouncing. If we had responsible political parties in this country, the Democrats would be telling these anti-ICE protesters, stay home, don't go out there and cause confrontations and risk violence. Be responsible. And in fact, if they were actually saying they would be allowing local police to collaborate with ICE officers to remove criminal illegal aliens. I mean, people who have violent criminal records who are illegal aliens. I mean, it's just utterly absurd that the local police are not only not helping federal law enforcement officers, but are actually sympathizing with the protesters and not doing anything to quell the protesters or to corral people into certain areas to prevent any kind of confrontation. And one of the things you can know, you see, the reason why, of course, the people on the left go, well, this is all Trump's fault. It's like he's sending the SS and the Gestapo into blah, blah. The fact is, in all these other states, and all these states that are not deep blue states, like where local politicians and local police are collaborating with ICE, you don't have any of these incidents. You don't have any of these incidents. The only violence you have in those kind of states is when the person that they're trying to apprehend is using violence. You don't have like crowds of idiots out there that the police allow to run amok, like you have in Minnesota and Portland, Minneapolis and Portland and Seattle and places like that. So, the people who are causing this violence are not the people who are trying to enforce immigration laws. but the people who are trying to obstruct them from enforcing immigration laws. And that includes like Democrat politicians, and it includes local police and Democrat areas who are ordered by those politicians to stand down and not to, you know, uh, uh, preserve any kind of crowd control and do all the kind of thing that police are supposed to be doing in these situations, right? So they're creating the situation. The Democrat politicians, with the help of the media, and with the cowardice of the police chiefs. The police chiefs usually are appointed by these politicians, and so they're kind of docile tools of the politicians. I'm sure a lot of the law. I'm sure a lot of the rank and file local police in these cities would like to actually help federal
Mhm.
law officers get rid of the violent criminals, but they're not being allowed to by their own police chiefs and by their superiors. I mean,
Yeah.
they've created this situation where they're encouraging the kind of activities that are going to lead to violent confrontations and ultimately to these tragic incidents where people are killed. And then they're going to blame it. They're trying to make it seem like it's all the fault of Trump and the federal government. You know, that's their
Yeah, I
playbook.
imagine that these people are actually thrilled that these awful encounters occurred. That
I
they
am
have
sure that
it's
they are. I'm sure that they are. You know, all the crocodile tears that they're crying about these people, they love this. In my
yes.
opinion, this is exactly what the Democrats are hoping for, is these terrible incidents, which then they can use to depict like Trump as a Nazi, and you know, I mean, that's exactly
It's a
what they're hoping.
godsend to cover up the incompetence and corruption and
Oh,
everything
that's
else
the
that's
other
going
thing.
on.
Yes, it's the perfect way to detract attention from from the massive fraud that's going on in these Democrat states, where they're giving people driver's licenses and voting cards in many cases. I mean, this is just like an unbelievable scandal, and
Yeah.
something really needs to be done about it. And all this is a very convenient distraction for these corrupt Democrat politicians. Who, you know, just who, despite feigning all this humanitarian concern for illegal immigrants and blah blah blah, which they have no concern at all for American citizens whose lives are violated by these people, but all this phony humanitarian concern. It's basically it's in most cases it's a cynical strategy by the Democrat Party to import more voters who are going to vote for them. That's really what this is all about, in my opinion.
Yeah. The performative empathy or
Yeah,
whatever you want to call it.
performative empathy, and performative virtue signaling, but of the kind that is really endangering other people's lives and creating like a toxic, chaotic situation. Um, so
Yeah.
anyway, just like in 2020, the summer of Floyd, where they you know they created this completely bogus narrative about the George Floyd death, and then
Yes.
whipped up all this hysteria about some systemic racism and white supremacy, and all these idiots were out there protesting in these cities, violent protests. You know, did $2 billion worth of damage. About 30 people were killed in the course of all this violent disruption, and you know they didn't give a goddamn about it because it actually benefited them politically. You know,
Yeah,
I mean,
and for me, it's not even clear that the George Floyd thing was even a racial incident.
I don't think it was a racial
I don't
incident.
even like how could anyone draw a conclusion like that? And I don't even think Derek Chauvin. It seems like he followed the protocol in that incident, but
Yeah, I mean,
um,
look, there's no evidence at all that that the incident with George Floyd had any racial motivation at all. That was a totally flawed. But they tried to fit it into this ridiculous narrative, which is a fraudulent narrative anyway, about all these innocent black people being killed by racist police and all that stuff. And half the you know, which is a very rare incident, by the way, a very rare event, and half the incidents that they tried to use to buttress this ridiculous narrative turned out to be fraudulent. And so they tried to do the same thing, and they did it quite successfully with the Floyd case. I mean, you know, Chauvin actually worked with Floyd. They both were bouncers at clubs in their off time.
yeah,
He knew George Floyd.
yeah,
You know, so the idea, and the other officers, like one of the officers was Asian, and there was one who was Hispanic or something. I mean, you know,
it's
to make it seem
absurd.
like a racial issue is just like
Yes,
completely absurd, you know. And
and
also, it wasn't murder. Also, it wasn't a case of murder. I mean, the worst thing you can say about Chauvin is that he was negligent, that he should have called the EMT people sooner, because you know, George
yeah,
Floyd had taken fentanyl and he was having problems breathing, and he kept him sort of like subdued for too long before he called the EMTs. You could claim negligence there. You could maybe fire him. But the idea that he murdered somebody, he deliberately murdered somebody for racial reasons, and should spend like
Ridiculous.
decades in prison. I mean, the whole thing is just utterly absurd.
Yeah. I
Well,
think most people watched I did like a mental exercise. I was at the dog park and I'm like, how many of these people actually watched the full police interaction between George Floyd and the police?
oh, I'm sure
Like
like
none.
1%. Yeah,
Me.
exactly. Yeah, 1%.
Everyone just watched like 10 seconds of footage and
Correct.
didn't. He was clearly already having some sort of cardiac event in the car.
That's right.
When they
That's
had
right,
him in
he
the
was.
car, he was already calling for his mother and foaming at the mouth.
Right.
He was already dying, it seemed. I don't know, I'm
Well,
not
it seemed like he was
expert,
already having
but
like a fentanyl overdose.
yeah, an overdose. Yeah. So Jeff,
But anyway,
regarding
the same thing's true of these recent cases. How many of these people who are immediately making assumptions about these two deaths in Minneapolis, how many people have actually watched the videos?
probably not. I don't even think I've personally seen enough context preceding the events.
I finally did that with the earlier video. I watched like all the footage that people had taken from that earlier video.
Yeah.
Of that woman. And, that went back several minutes before the actual incident. You can see that this was building up into a provocative situation with her partner and all this kind of stuff. And then this morning, I said I watched several videos of the, of the thing. And it was obviously a confusing melee. They realized that they found out that the guy had a gun. By the way, you're allowed to have a gun, but you're supposed to be carrying your permit with you. He wasn't carrying his permit with him. And
right.
he wasn't carrying his IDs with him.
Yeah, I mean, who would get into a physical scuffle with law enforcement while concealed carrying? Like,
right,
what the fuck?
It wasn't even concealed. It was like, who would get into a physical scuffle with the police while carrying a gun?
Yeah, it's just.
I mean, are you nuts?
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to create an incident where you're a martyr? Because that's what you've
probably.
done. Right? Yeah.
So Jeff, with all of that in mind, because I want to get to oikophobia, and I think this ties into oikophobia, all of this like bullshit empathy.
Bullshit. Yeah.
But what should Trump do? Because on the one hand, I feel like I'm a person who voted for him for deportations, not just of violent criminals, but also of illegal immigrants.
Right.
I think this is basically like an insurrection. They are violating the will of the people. So, people don't seem to have the stomach anymore for these things.
Well, but here's exactly what happened. And you knew this was going to happen. People were going to vote for closing the borders, rightly so. They were going to certainly support deporting criminal illegal aliens, and a lot of people voted to deport all illegal aliens. Okay, the problem though is, in principle that sounds good. Well, okay, millions of people came into this country. We want these people all to be deported. The problem is then somebody's going to arrest somebody who was a gardener for been here for 15 years. Right. And has been a gardener for all these people in a neighborhood. And everybody likes the person. He's a hard worker and he does good work for cheap. And all of a sudden there's a nice guy being deported. Right. And that just seems unfair. Right. And so this is part of the problem that we have is that people are always going to have anecdotal things where they know people who are here illegally, who are really good people and who they like a lot. And they don't want those people to be deported, even if they support deporting large numbers of people. They don't want it to be people that they like and know, Yeah. And so every single time you have an incident where somebody is arrested and deported, who's been here for a while, sometimes accidentally, sometimes they just pick people up accidentally. There's a case of mistaken identity. So that's another problem. They have to have, all these arrests are based on intel, and they have to have good intel. If they have bad intel, they're going to be arresting the wrong people. That's going to look bad. But the other thing is that if you're arresting somebody who isn't like a criminal and who's actually sort of established a life here and is, working and paying taxes, it looks mean, and it seems like unfair to snatch that person off the street and deport them. And every incident like that, every time there's going to be an incident where somebody is arrested accidentally, that's gonna be front page headlines in the media. And, oh, look at all the horrible things that the Trump is doing, and that every incident that they can exploit politically, they're going to exploit. And so that's why it's very important not to give them ammunition when you're arresting people. But I think there's a much simpler solution. I mean, I think you don't need to. I don't think you need to arrest like 40 million. I don't know, probably 35 million people in this country illegally. Let's say you're just going back and trying to get rid of like the 8 million that Biden let in.
Mm-hmm.
Who haven't really established themselves and haven't really not paying taxes and are probably on the dole, probably getting federal assistance of some kind or state assistance. I mean, the simplest way to pressure people who are in this country illegally to go back home is to cut off all benefits to them. To cut off all benefits to them. They don't get any welfare. They don't get any food stamps. They don't get any housing allotments. They don't get any free education. They don't get free health care. They don't get a goddamn thing. That's the way to get rid of most of these people voluntarily. Most of these people are going to go, well, hell, I came here thinking I was going to have access to all this stuff, and now I've been cut off, and how am I going to survive? And now what's going to happen if the federal government tomorrow could say, and this would be the solution in Europe too, that we're not going to provide any benefits whatsoever to non-citizens who come into this country illegally, period. Full stop. What's going to happen is these blue states are going to say, well, we're going to provide them money because we want these people to stay here and vote for us. And so if they want to spend state money subsidizing these people, that's fine. But then the federal government should cut off money to those states. The federal government.
Well, they're all bankrupt. All the blue states seem to be in
the
trouble.
Blue states are already in bad shape financially. So the federal government should cut off all subsidies to any state that wants to devote funds to subsidizing illegals. And then if private corporations, if all these wealthy billionaires, these progressive billionaires want to step into the gap and subsidize these people, well, let them be the people who are paying the costs instead of American taxpayers at the very least.
Well, they already paid for their travel expenses to get here. So
that's right. They've already paid for the travel expenses. And all these all these charitable organizations, Catholic charities and NGOs that have brought all these people here and are helping them, they're getting money from federal government. Yeah. They've been getting money from the federal government for decades. They've been enriching themselves with money from the federal government. All that stuff should be cut off. All those organizations should be completely cut off from federal funding. So to me, the best way to encourage the largest number of people to remigrate or to go back home is just to cut off all the assistance that they're being given in this country.
Yeah. And
then you're going to be left with a much smaller core of people that you might have to actually arrest and put it on a plane and deport.
Yeah.
And also you're going to deter other people from coming. This is the other thing. If you cut off all public assistance, any kind of benefits to people who come to your country illegally, that's going to staunch the flow of people who want to come there. And because, we have millions of stories in Europe where illegal migrants will arrive in Europe. They'll arrive in Greece or Italy, or someplace where they can't get a lot of benefits. And then they don't want to stay there. They want to immediately migrate to Germany, Holland, or Scandinavia, where they're going to get better benefits. So it's clear that one of their primary incentive getting these people to Europe is to get on the gravy train. To get on the gravy train in one of these countries that's providing, excessive aid to illegals. So that provides a huge incentive for hundreds of thousands or millions of people to pour into Europe or pour into Western countries. And if you cut all that off, they're not going to be motivated to do it.
And it's economic illegal immigration.
Yes.
It's not political. By and large, it's not. These aren't political dissidents.
Oh, no. These people are not refugees. There's been many studies in Europe now. The number of people, only a tiny percentage of these migrants can be legitimately categorized as refugees.
Yeah.
And by the way, according to international law, if you're in a country where you're being persecuted or you're like in danger because of the civil war, you have to go to the nearest country where you can get a safe haven. Mm-hmm. That's what you're obliged to do.
Yeah.
You don't have a right to go halfway across the world to a country that's giving you all kinds of benefits.
Yeah, the game was to fly to Mexico. If you're going to fly to Mexico and then cross.
If you're a bona fide refugee, you've got to go to the nearest country where you can get a safe haven.
Yeah.
That's according to international law. So to pretend that the majority of these people are refugees fleeing war and persecution is a complete lie, and that's of course what the progressives and the left have been peddling for decades. But there's facts on the ground prove it's not the case. I mean, many studies have been done in European countries now that demonstrate that that's simply not the case. That the overall majority of these people are economic migrants. They're not bona fide refugees.
Yeah. All of this. So Jeff, I read Benedict Beckeld's book on oikophobia and civilizational collapse, which was great at your recommendation. And then I even had a conversation with him about his book.
Good. He's a good interviewer.
Now I can't even. Now I can't. I seem to only see the world in terms of, at least what we're living now, as a repetition of a historical cycle that has come before and Rome and Greece. Do you agree with that premise and framing?
I completely agree with that premise, and I've been telling everybody for years now. I've been telling people that I feel like we're following the same cycle as previous great civilizations and great imperial powers, where there's two different issues that happen. When a power becomes a great power, it expands its territory and incorporates a more diverse population of people. Usually it oftentimes conquers people, and then they become part of an imperial system, like in Rome or, Byzantium or the Chinese Empire or whatever. And so then all of a sudden you have all these people who from different ethnocultural groups that are inside your borders. And when there's enough of them, they start to organize to try to get certain rights that citizens that only citizens were previously allowed to have. So that's one issue. The other issue is that, like Beckeld points out, is that rising civilizations tend to be they're convinced that their own civilization is the best civilization. They're convinced that they have a right to expand their civilization vis-a-vis other peoples who they regard as having a civilization that's more primitive or more backward, or however you want to characterize it. So during that phase of imperial expansion, when countries become powerful and they expand their territory, they take over more territory, and then they incorporate more and more people. The elites ruling those countries are absolutely convinced of their own civilizational superiority, and their own civilizational superiority is in fact manifested in part by the fact that they're able to conquer and subjugate all these other people, right? But then what happens is, once you've got this elaborate imperial structure, then you have people who are part of the elite who begin abandoning the values that made that civilization great. They begin to criticize their own civilization. They see flaws in their own civilization, because in every civilization there are flaws. And so you have a certain stratum of the elites within every successful civilization that begin to carp about all the negative things about their own civilization, like the corruption of the elites or whatever. And then in some cases they begin to romanticize other groups of people, usually people who are at a lesser civilizational level.
Somali pirates, for example.
Yeah, Somali pirates nowadays. but like for example, Herodotus, the Greek historian, depicted some of the non-Greek peoples, and talked about their merits and everything like that. In some cases, he was doing that to criticize, some aspects of the Greek city-states and so forth. And then, of course, the best example may be the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote the book the Germania, about the Germanic tribes, when he had this totally romantic picture of the Germanic tribes. That it was a meritocracy. They had all this honor and value. They weren't corrupt, and they had this kind of egalitarianism and so forth and so on, in contrast to the hierarchical Roman society where the patricians were lording it over the plebeians, and all this kind of thing, right? And then you see that probably the ultimate example of this is Rousseau, Rousseau criticizing the excesses of the old regime France by romanticizing primitive groups, the noble savage, portraying all these people who lived in much more backwards primitive societies as being noble, inherently noble, and using that as to contrast the corruption of the elites in France and so forth and so on. So this is and also you have the guy who did the Black Legend when Spain was conquering the Americas, conquering the Aztecs and the Incas, and you have that guy Bartolomé de las Casas, or there's two of these clerics, and I always get them confused at this particular point. I haven't read them in decades, but one of them created a kind of black legend, was really harshly critical of like Spanish imperial rule and mistreatment of the Indians and so forth and so on, and to some extent involved in romanticizing the Indians who had been subjugated and defeated. So this is a long-standing trope in the West. This thing where elites begin to be hypercritical of their own civilization. Because, one of the great things about the West is the self-criticism, the ability to correct mistakes, the ability to learn, the ability to evolve and progress and so forth and so on. That's one of the distinctive features of Western civilization. The problem is that ability to self-examine and self-criticize can become toxic. And it becomes, like a level of self-criticism which is completely over the top and unrealistic and deranged in a way, and it ends up undermining the values of the civilization, that civilization. And so I think you do see it, particularly in the West. I mean, you see these phenomena to some extent in non-Western civilizations, but it's most pronounced in the West, where we have this long tradition from ancient Greece on of self-reflection and self-criticism and so forth and so on, philosophical reflection, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, the point being is that it's most characteristic of the West, where Western elements of Western elites begin to viciously criticize their own civilization and romanticize other civilizations as a way of criticizing their own civilization. And then what the ultimate result is that leads to a situation where the elites of these great civilizations abandon the values that made them great. And that's exactly what we have now. I mean, you look at the elites in the contemporary West, and
you could draw this right to Minneapolis, could you not?
You could draw it to Minneapolis, but it's a much more widespread phenomenon. Look at the kind of people, the kind of pea-brain, small people who were elected as European prime ministers in most European countries, people like Macron and this idiot, the goof in Germany, and Starmer in the UK. I mean, look at these small-minded people, pathetic, small-minded people who seem to dislike their own country and dislike their own civilization. And look at all the sovereignty that they've ceded to the European Union. This group of unelected bureaucrats who are trying to impose all these harmful policies and toxic values on every country that's a member of the European Union. I mean, these are all people who have abandoned the values that made European civilization the world's greatest civilization. And the policies they're promoting are actually undermining and destroying that civilization. Trying to undermine national sovereignty, promoting mass migration, promoting multiculturalism, denigrating the history of the West, denigrating the values of the West. All this kind of stuff is totally self-destructive behavior, which is going to lead, in my opinion, which is leading right now to the erosion and it could lead to the eventual collapse of the West.
Yeah. One of the things that he mentions in the book that we just talked about, I think, is emotionalism. Relativism and emotionalism.
Correct.
Which I find is just a weapon of the left in this country.
Oh, absolutely.
And from a kind of contemporary perspective, the interaction with the ICE agents, that this is mean, that deporting a so-called person of color is a mean racist thing to do, and racist. Mm-hmm. So how can that be? It's also very anti-intellectual.
Totally anti-intellectual.
So you find yourself in a debate on illegal immigration in this country. It just devolves when you're talking to someone on the left about meanness or not.
That's right. Yeah.
empathy or not. And I
Correct.
reject that. I've started to just reject that completely. I refuse to engage in it because it's just an emotional manipulation.
Well, that's exactly what it
It's
is.
not a real debate. It's saying that
No, it's
I
not.
don't have empathy and
Mhm.
somebody else does, which is not true.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
I've even come up with, I've been trying to come up with, how would you classify these people? I have two questions. One, they seem to classify themselves as having narcissistically as having being more empathic
Hmm.
and sort of better people. Tim Walz
Right.
is a good guy. They care about
Yeah,
people.
exactly.
That's what this is about: caring and not caring, having
Yes.
a heart, being heartless.
Hmm.
So how can someone on the right like me say, I don't consider myself a conservative. I don't believe in like prescribing lifestyle choices to people, though I think people probably have better lives when they embrace socially conservative values, but I don't think they should be forced on anyone. But I'm pro freedom, pro Second
Yeah.
Amendment. So how can
Well,
that be? How could you? I was trying to think of a label that would wrap in empathy to holding those views because I don't think they're exclusive. So what if you were like a bleeding heart post liberal or something, or a bleeding heart right winger? Like, is there some way to label, to kind of deactivate that bullshit
well, I first of all,
leftist
first of
language
all,
and labeling?
yes. First of all, I'm a liberal. I'm not a conservative, and I'm kind of a cultural subversive, but I'm certainly not a
Yeah,
conservative. And so I'm not a person on the right. I'm an old-fashioned liberal, but I'm not a bleeding heart. I'm not a bleeding heart liberal because
but
a
maybe
bleeding.
you're a bleeding heart in your personal life.
No, I'm not a bleeding
Um,
heart. I'm not a
uh,
bleeding heart in my personal life. I mean, I'm a nice person. I mean, I'm a nice person who's respectful. I'm a
yeah.
nice person who's respectful, but I'm definitely not a bleeding heart. I'm definitely not a person who's going, getting all emotionally overwrought about shit. Man, I'm not that kind of person at all. In fact, that's the problem. I try to see things in the most realistic, fact-based way possible. I try
Sure.
not to let my emotions subvert my cerebral thinking. You know what I mean? I don't I
And
don't
even
want my
if you were,
rationality.
yeah, even if you were, it's your job to keep that in your personal life and separate from policy and how you think the
Correct.
world should
Yeah. I mean, if you
like.
want to be if you think of yourself as a rational person, you want to sublimate your emotionalism so that you can be more objective. You want to try to detach yourself emotionally from things. So to me, all this bleeding heart stuff basically leads to disaster because it short circuits rational thought. When people are overly emotional, it short circuits their rational thought, and then everything's just about their feelings. Oh, I feel it makes me feel good. Or I don't feel good. I don't feel good about that. It's all about their feelings. That plus the other thing you mentioned, the relativism. This horrible relativism, moral relativism. Like postmodernism, where nothing's better than anything else. That you don't have a right to criticize other people's cultures. Every culture is equally valuable. It's just complete and utter fucking nonsense because there's obviously many cultures in human history that are completely horrible and that have collapsed and that have degenerated into the worst kinds of atrocities. So the idea that every human society is equally valuable, or every culture is accepted, it should be is viewed the same. I mean, look, a perfect example of this is this ridiculous thing about female genital mutilation. you know, I mean, yeah, you can say, well, female genital mutilation is commonplace in certain Muslim countries, it's commonplace in certain African countries, and but that's just their culture. There's nothing wrong with it. You can't really make judgments about it. Well, yeah, I think you
Maybe
can.
it's superior. I don't. Maybe it's better. I don't know.
Yeah, you can make judgments about it though,
Like,
and certainly, human beings have a right to make judgments. The idea that a human being shouldn't has no right to judge other people's behavior or other people's values. I mean, of course it's totally absurd. Human beings are judging creatures. That's we have mental capacity. That means we're constantly evaluating and judging things. So the idea to say that it's unfair to judge other people, other individuals who may be behaving badly, or it's unfair to judge the regressive features of other cultures, to criticize the regressive features of other cultures. I mean, it's just a stupid, naive thing that has no relation to reality.
Yeah.
So when you combine that kind of idiotic moral relativism with this hyper emotionalism, which is basically what you see on the left pretty much everywhere now, on the radical left and on the progressive left.
And
Fake.
half the time fake and
totally fake.
narcissistic performances.
Yeah, it's narcissistic, it's performative, it's fake. And the reason why you know it's fake is because the same people are always talking about how compassionate and humanitarian and loving and concerned they are the most bigoted, hateful people in the world against people who disagree with them. Anybody they disagree with, they smear as a racist, a fascist, a Nazi, whatever. I mean, these are the most bigoted, hateful people in the world. These progressives that think of themselves as being so compassionate and concerned and loving and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they're completely incapable of self-reflection, of recognizing the contradictions in their own behavior.
Well, this is what I wondered from reading Beckeld's book, Jeff. Like, the other part of this is that it's status seeking, like the showing that you're evolved to other people and that you care more and you're more sophisticated. And it's just narcissistic status seeking.
Absolutely, it's status seeking.
So is there a way, I was, after I read his book, I thought, like, in a parallel universe of sanity, this book would be like near the top of the New York Times review of books, and every coastal elite pseudo-intellectual or whatever would be talking about this and saying, like, oh, we're in a time of oikophobia. This is where we are.
Correct.
So would it be possible, this is what I asked Beckeld also, would it be possible that the awareness itself of being oikophobic could puncture this bubble that these people exist in? Because it's very embarrassing. It should be embarrassing, at least, to behave this way and then to read something like this and become aware and just think, like, oh my God, I'm just like a pedestrian victim of a historical cycle. It's so low, it's base.
Yeah, it is.
Could that be like a remedy for oikophobia itself, or no?
Well, I think you have to really question anybody who has become so guilty, has somehow been indoctrinated to be so guilty about their own culture and their own civilization and their own country that they prioritize the interests of everybody else above the interests of their own citizens. Above the interests, they prioritize the interests of every dysfunctional group above the interests of their own law-abiding citizens. I mean, so just look at the people that the left champions. The left champions criminals, predatory criminals who it portrays as victims. They're these criminals are victims of society. They shouldn't be incarcerated. They should be out on bail. All this kind of stuff, right? I mean, even though if a guy's got a rap sheet like a mile long and has committed multiple violent offenses, we shouldn't put him in prison, right? So, imagine portraying the victimizers as the victims. That's what the left does with criminals. Think about the homeless people. You're portraying the homeless people as just basically functional people who, through no fault of their own, ended up without a home. Instead of recognizing that these are people who are mentally ill, or they're people who are drug addicted or alcoholics or both, or in some cases petty criminals, or people who are lazy and don't want to do anything. These are not functional people, and to sort of pretend like that we can solve the homeless problem just by allowing people to live on the street and giving them resources, that somehow they're going to suddenly become functional people, and that's just never going to happen. So there again, you've got misplaced empathy for the wrong people, and now you've got the illegal people who are here illegally, where you've got all these bleeding hearts, as you were talking about, having so much concern and sympathy for people who snuck into this country and are not even citizens. What about all the people in this country who are suffering economically, who are poor and in a desperate economic situation? What about why not have sympathy for your own fellow citizens before you have sympathy for foreigners? I mean, it just doesn't make it makes no sense. And why prioritize the interests of people who are dysfunctional rather than the interests of people who are law-abiding, productive citizens. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. But that's the whole mindset of the left. Like everybody's a victim. Everybody's a victim, and we have to sympathize with all these people that they declare to be victims, even if these people are mainly victims of their own dysfunctionality and victims of their own stupidity and bad choices, right? I mean,
Yeah. There's nothing worse, I guess, for a leftist, there's nothing worse than a white working class poor person.
that's right. Yeah, there's nothing worse.
There's nothing more grotesque to a liberal or a leftist than that person.
Well, not to a genuine liberal, but to
A progressive.
Yeah, to an illiberal progressive or a leftist, there's nothing worse than a poor white working class person at this point. Even though traditionally, of course, the Marxist left were the claim to be the champions of like that very demographic.
Yeah.
So that shows you really how the left has just gone totally off the deep end.
Yeah, I saw this guy yesterday who had come out with his gun to like protect people in Minneapolis, who was a self-professed communist.
Yes.
And was like, I represent workers internationally so that they can feel safe. And I'm like, yeah, so you're protecting the undermining of the wages of workers in this country in favor of the importation of other people. Like,
right.
You fucking genius.
Nothing these people says can be accepted. Because either they're fanatics who believe things that are just nonsensical.
Yeah.
Or in some cases, they're just lying about what their actual agenda is, depending on the context. So either they're people who are delusional and have embraced ideas that have repeatedly shown themselves throughout modern history to be completely catastrophically harmful, or they're people who have a much more malicious agenda, but are just trying to conceal it behind like a humanitarian veneer, So
yeah.
Either way, they're very dangerous people, and people need to recognize that this is that allowing these kinds of people to have any kind of influence in a democratic society is going to undermine and destroy democracy.
Yeah. What did you, Jeff? We have to wrap up, but I did want to ask you about Greenland.
Greenland. I mean, look, I'm glad. Let's just get back to the final point, because mainly we've been criticizing, talking about the problems, like in Minneapolis, and problems created by the left, the liberal progressive people, and the radical leftists, and Democrat politicians who are cynically manipulating them. But we have to talk about the fact that Trump is making a lot of serious mistakes, in my opinion. And like the whole rhetoric that he was using vis-a-vis Canada, when he first got reelected and he took office, and just kind of like insulting, demeaning, provocative rhetoric, which was guaranteed to alienate not only the politicians he was criticizing, but also large numbers of Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, with this whole Greenland thing, talking about how we're going to take over Greenland and, blah, 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 blah. And, it's one thing to highlight problems. I mean, Trump, has a particular negotiating, transactional, rhetorical style where he says something inflammatory and provocative to focus people's attention on an issue. And that can be a good thing. But when you keep up using like this kind of rhetoric, which even after it becomes increasingly counterproductive, there's no sense in it at all, And I mean, he's his own worst enemy. The very thing that makes him a great mobilizer of people, some of his characterological traits are things that actually inhibit him from actually successfully carrying out some of the things he wants to carry out, the bombast and the exaggeration and the kind of like pettiness, sometimes the petty rhetoric, the petty demeaning rhetoric. And so like the whole way that he was treating like Denmark over this Greenland thing was just totally stupid and counterproductive. Yeah, there are very, very valid reasons why we want to have de facto influence in Greenland, because it's a vital geopolitical significance, both in terms of Arctic security, in terms of access to various kinds of metals, and also the rivalry in space, because this is really where a lot of this the satellite stuff in space right now. There's a rivalry between the United States and China to take sort of a certain hegemony in space, and Greenland in that area is a vital area where this kind of thing is important. There's a really good podcast I wanted to recommend to you.
Yeah.
There's a guy, there's Unheard, which is a good website, and they have a podcast. The host his name is Freddie Sayers.
Yeah,
And
I know.
he had a thing like maybe 2 weeks ago where he interviewed 3 people who were experts on Greenland. And I really strongly recommend that everybody listens to that, because one was a Danish person who was talking a little about the historical thing. And then the other two were kind of experts on geopolitics, and one was an expert on Arctic. And anyway, they really clarified, I think, what the issues are of Greenland. And when you actually hear that, you can say, well, okay, fine. Trump starts out by throwing a rhetorical grenade to get people's attention. Fine. At that point, you just go talk to the Danish government privately, and you say, look, we want to expand our military footprint in Greenland, which, by the way, the Danes agreed to let us do during the Cold War. We have bases up there that we could expand and so forth and so on without consulting with them. We could have just gone to Denmark and said, look, we want to have more facilities and equipment up there so we can monitor what the Russians and the Chinese are doing, because the Russians and Chinese are messing around in the Arctic. And even the Danish intelligence service issued a report in 2025 warning about Arctic security and the threat from China and Russia. So the Danes are aware that there's a threat. So would it have been a better solution just to go and sort of negotiate with the Danes and say, look, we want to make sure, we want to guarantee our security, American security, in this part of the Western Hemisphere, and it's also going to help the security of Denmark and NATO, instead of talking about we're going to take over Greenland and the military option is on the table and all that kind of nonsense. And then it just whipped up all the European girly men into hysteria.
Well, I think that in itself was worth it to me.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny to watch them talk tough, like Macron sends 34 French troops to Greenland in case of an American invasion. I mean, you can't make that stupid shit up, man. It's just so absurd.
Seeing Trump eviscerate all of these people at Davos is worth.
Yeah, Trump really made fools out of them at Davos, but again, you have to know when to pull back. One of the problems with Trump is he'll get mad about something. Somebody will say something that he feels insulted by, and then he'll want to lash out in some petty juvenile way at the person. You got to know when to be aggressive and provocative, and then when to roll it back and be sensible. Otherwise, you're going to end up with counterproductive effects. We probably wouldn't even have that knucklehead Carney as the Canadian Prime Minister if Trump hadn't been.
That's true. He stirred up even patriotic right-wing Canadians were sort of stirred up by that.
And then the funniest thing is that for decades the Europeans and the European politicians and the Canadian politicians and the progressives who voted for them have been trying to undermine the national sovereignty of their own country by promoting mass immigration and promoting indigenous First Nations rights in Canada and all this stuff. They've been deliberately trying to undermine the national sovereignty of their own country throughout Europe and in Canada. And then the moment Trump makes a belligerent threat, all of a sudden they start defending their national sovereignty. All of a sudden national sovereignty becomes important to them. It's so laughable. It's so utterly laughable.
It does push a button, though, and I think, under the subject of oikophobia and the prolonging an empire, I was thinking about Greenland and the Venezuela raid, that foreign conquest, and just the success of that raid was an injection of, I don't know, masculine energy into the culture and American greatness.
Yes.
And also it's a good thing. It's necessary for an empire.
Well, I think that generally Trump has been right about military interventions, because they're short and overwhelming, and then he's not getting us bogged down and with troops on the ground and all boots on the ground and all this kind of stuff. I think he made a mistake in Iran. I think after destroying the Iranian nuclear facility, he should have let the Israelis continue blasting the rulers and cadres of that regime and try to bring the regime down right at that point without any kind of troops on the ground. But I think the Iranian regime was on the verge of collapse right at that moment. I mean, Khamenei was in hiding. The Israelis said they knew where all the leaders of the Iranian regime were hiding. I mean, they could have just taken a lot of those people out, destroyed the operational capability of the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij, made it impossible for them to repress a popular revolt. That would have been the time to just finish that job. I think.
What about pulling back this time, like during this popular uprising, and after he tweeted saying
a mistake. You don't encourage people to keep revolting and say you got their back and then not do anything. That was a mistake. I mean, the sanctions alone are not going to bring down the regime. If you're telling the Iranian people keep protesting, even at their own risk, at some point you got to take some military action, even if it's making surgical strikes to degrade the capabilities, the repressive capabilities of like the Revolutionary Guards and the military. You've got to do something to help protect the population from reprisal. And so I think that was a terrible mistake that Trump made. And he's also made two big mistakes with Qatar. Qatar should be regarded not as an ally, but as a hostile enemy state.
I agree.
And cozying up to that horrible jihadist regime in Syria. No, that guy is an enemy. That's an enemy regime. And now he's attacking our Kurdish allies in Syria.
And they just sprung thousands of ISIS fighters.
Springing thousands of ISIS fighters. I mean, that should have been right. I mean, that should have led to massive air attacks on the Syrian, whatever Syrian forces were engaged in fighting against the Kurds. They should have been battered to hell by American air power.
But they did it. Trump's calculation would have been for the Saudi and Qatari money, right?
Yeah, but who cares ultimately? Who cares about the Qatari money is mainly a toxic negative thing. It's mainly funding radicalism in the U.S. It's funding Middle East study centers.
Funding podcasters in the U.S.
Funding podcasters, these horrible lunatics like Hassan Piker and all those jackasses, Mehdi Hassan, people like that. I mean, Qatar is not our ally. And we should stop pretending.
Why don't we just I posted something as like a joke during the Greenland discussion. Why don't we just take Qatar? It's 300,000 people. What kind of civilization allows like a tiny Bedouin clan, thousands of miles away, to run its foreign policy and dictate what direction it's supposed to take? It's obscene.
It's absurd. Yeah. I mean, look, that's a regime we could overthrow in one day. But I think a better approach would just be to go to Qatar and just warn those people in no uncertain terms. Number one, we're not going to allow you to funnel money into the United States to support Islamist networks and to create other kinds of problems. We're not going to let you do that. And if you continue behaving in certain ways, there's going to be serious consequences. I mean, they need to be warned.
Yeah, but that's not what everyone's seems to be taking the money.
Yeah, which I think, again, is just maybe another sign of the decadence of Western civilization, that we're allowing ourselves to be corrupted by money from regimes that are hostile. It makes no sense. I mean, the whole impulse to trade with China and to allow China to build up China to become a huge power that now is contesting the U.S. for hegemony. That was a terrible mistake that the successive American administrations made, thinking that if we traded more with China, it would somehow lead to some kind of democratic transition. So naive, so utterly
ridiculous.
Stupid. Yeah. So anyway, that's the kind of people we're dealing with, though. We're dealing with people in the establishment of the United States, in particular the foreign policy establishment, that have been wrong about everything. They literally been wrong about everything for decades, and they never learned any lessons from their mistakes. And so these are people who should not be anywhere near policy-making circles, because anybody that has that long of a record of failure should be completely discredited and have no influence whatsoever in any kind of American political administration.
Right. But
just the final point I want to make here. So I think my biggest concern now is that I feel like the rise of nationalism and populism is the only thing I think that can save the West. And I think Trump was, the only person maybe who could reverse like all the damage that's been done by a bipartisan establishment, by a corrupt, feckless bipartisan establishment for a period of many decades in the United States. And I think he's squandering the opportunity. I mean, by making like some very bad mistakes. Um, and uh, and so, it seems likely the Democrats are going to take both houses of Congress next year unless something really changes. And I just feel like somebody has to he's got to get good advice from somebody. I mean, all these things that we were going to be doing, not only closing the border, which was done, and deporting, but also cutting the size of the federal government, that petered out. That should have been something that kept going. I mean, the U.S. government should be about 50% as large as it actually is, right? All these people in like the establishment and like the State Department who've been wrong about so many, just get rid of them, just terminate them. What do we need them for? They've done more damage to the United States than good, right? I mean, all these bloated bureaucracies filled with incompetent people who are increasingly partisan. I mean, it's not benefiting the American people. They're like a parasitic entity sucking the blood of the American people, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
So I don't really understand. I just feel like we have there was like a window of opportunity here where maybe we could have reversed some of the worst trends. But I just feel like if Trump doesn't get on track and he keeps making blunders, that I mean, whatever happens in the midterm elections, I mean, if the Democrats win the next presidential election, we're going to have open borders again. We're going to have mass.
It's over.
Basically, the end of the country, because they're going to create a system like they have in California, where it's a one-party state.
Yeah,
there's going to be no possibility for any other party, whether it's Republicans or some third party, to actually win an election if millions of people that the Democrats have brought in are given a path to citizenship and allowed to vote in elections. I mean, that's going to make it impossible.
This is the whole reason why I, like, from the beginning of this conversation about the need for mass deportation, it's like an attack on sovereignty of the country and voting.
That's exactly
itself.
What it is.
So
yeah, I mean, just anybody who's opposed to voter ID is somebody who wants to facilitate cheating.
1,000%. Yeah.
Yeah, all the arguments these people have to oppose voter ID are so transparently.
It's bullshit. It's obvious bullshit.
Obvious.
Yeah, I think people on the right and maybe middle of the road people who voted for Trump seem to think that after the election that this was like over, woke is dead, we won. That is so not the case at all, as evidenced by Virginia, what's happening in Minneapolis, that this is like, we're like in the middle of a war, basically.
Well, that's essentially, we're in the midst of a major cultural war. And the idea that woke is, I mean, look, the progressive left has attained hegemony in every leading American institution over the past several decades. And to think that the one presidential election is going to somehow be able to reverse all that. I mean, they've taken over the educational system. They've taken over the media. They've taken over NGOs. They've taken over the government bureaucracy. I mean, so the idea that one single president dealing with a partisan Congress that can't do anything is somehow going to be able to undo decades of institutionalization of this kind of stuff. It's just not true, so.
Yeah, no, we need like another 8 years of, in my opinion, like MAGA, America first.
I would say we need another 8 years of like some government that I would say should be a centrist government that is going to aggressively try to dismantle like progressive and left-wing hegemony in all of our leading institutions. Yeah. That's what we really need.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end with that objective.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
All right. Talk to you later. Talk to you next time, as they say.